I think there are two different pushes on Putin right now, one of which is the one you just identified, that he's been humiliated, needs to show that he has fist in his glove because he has not been able to deter the Ukrainians from taking increasingly extraordinary military strikes at him. And he's not been able to deter the US and NATO from providing the intelligence support, the military support to afford the Ukrainians to do that. So his deterrence, Putin's deterrence, has failed. He is not seen as credible in being able to hit back enough to scare these guys, to scare us, you know, the US and the UK. He's not scaring us. I see Putin today having more of an understanding than he did a week ago that this war going on and on for years and years might not be solely in Russia and Putin's advantage. That there might be some credible threats that the Ukrainians can make against him that he now needs to factor in.
Famously, before the election, he said he'd resolve this in 24 hours. Clearly, Putin was not prepared to go along with that timescale, but he has started talking in a more critical way about Putin, saying he's gone crazy and so on. It seems to me that Trump's patience is running pretty thin with Putin. But the question then becomes, what does he do to force pressure on Putin? Where should that pressure be applied, do you think, which would put maximum actual pressure on Putin to come to the ceasefire table?
So Biden tried the stick for a couple of years, gave a lot of weapons to Ukraine, was in lockstep with NATO, put a lot of sanctions on the Russians, and it didn't work, didn't do anything to convince Putin he needed to stop or slow down. Trump tried the carrot, reached out to Putin, said he'd go to the Kremlin for Victory Day, said he'd take off sanctions, said he would invest in critical minerals with the Russians in the Arctic and other places, would coordinate on national security. All Putin had to do was accept a ceasefire like the Ukrainians had, and the carrot didn't work either. The fact that Zelensky has caved to Trump's pressure, that's where Trump has had success, and accepted a ceasefire with no preconditions, and accepted a critical minerals deal that the Ukrainians didn't want to sign. Now Trump can say, when he comes to the NATO summit in the coming weeks, look how much more money the Europeans are putting into Ukraine. Look how much more they're spending on defense. Look how much the Ukrainians are not taking advantage of me. This isn't, just the Americans giving them taxpayer dollars. This is the Americans interested in defending our economic interests going forward. So we're going to continue to provide intelligence to Ukraine because we want to defend that. We're going to continue selling weapons to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians because we want to ensure that this war does not lead to Ukraine falling. I do think the West is to be blamed for the way they handled Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, the United States led the charge in creating the G7+1, the NATO-Russia Council. Neither of those things were meant to integrate Russia. They were, in fact, both set up to show that Russia was still outside of the club. So at no point were the Russians rebuilt. There was no Marshall Plan for Russia. There was no effort to truly engage. There was not enough money and political capital spent. It was formulaic. It was symbolic. It was because the Russians fell into America's lap, essentially. The U.S. won the Cold War without firing a shot. It wasn't like World War II, when the Americans became not only winners, but leaders, because we almost lost everything, right? That's not what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. So I think that the Russians blame the United States for not integrating them, for not caring about them, for lying to them about the fact that they wanted them to be part of the West. I don't think it's NATO enlargement that is the problem here. I do think that countries have the right to join a defensive alliance if they so choose. I think the problem is that Ukraine was not brought into NATO. I think what happened with Ukraine is exactly what happened to Russia with the G7+1. It's exactly what happened with Turkey with the EU. is you say, oh, we're interested in bringing you in, but we're never going to give you a membership action plan. We're never going to actually make it real. What Putin does is understands weakness. And he understood weakness in 2014 when he illegally annexes Crimea and he illegally sends his little green men and denies it into Southeast Ukraine. And the response, the collective response of the West is to do nothing, just like the collective response in Georgia in 2008 was nothing. So Putin understood this isn't NATO. Ukraine's not in NATO. And so if I go after them, they're still going to send their leaders to Moscow to meet me during the World Cup. They're still going to do business. They're going to build Nord Stream 2. He doesn't see a red light. He sees a flashing yellow light with a country that's not a part of NATO. And so he goes in. He lies, of course. They all say, oh, we're not going to war. That's propaganda. I am sympathetic to arguments that fundamentally say that the West didn't care about and mistreated Russia. But I think we need to recognize that it is a show of weakness of the West that gave the Russians everything they needed to do, not just to attack Ukraine, but they're going to end up with a significant piece of it.